So good morning, everybody. This is Massimo Leone, Director of the Center for Religious Studies at the Bruno Kessler Foundation. We have a new seminar in our series on enchantment, disenchantment, religion and ethics. And today we have the great pleasure to host a lecture by Professor Fiona Ellis from University of Nottingham. Professor Fiona Ellis, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Nottingham, and her most recent monograph is God, Value and Nature, published by Oxford University Press. She has published on a variety of subjects, including the philosophy of love and desire, the meaning of life, and the nature of religious understanding. She is presently working at the Hamilton Center, University of Florida, where she has a visiting position. She's also presently writing a monograph entitled The End of Desire, Meaning, Nihilism, and God. We're very pleased to have her today. Thank you very much for joining us. And we'll immediately give her a floor for a talk entitled Enchantment, Disenchantment, and the Death of God. Fiona Ellis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Massimo, and thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for turning out at this relatively early hour. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
So I sent the paper over just because I thought it would be easier to follow for everybody, and I think you've got it on the projector, yeah? This paper, the most interesting and difficult part from my point of view comes towards the end when I start talking about Nietzsche and the death of God, and this is where the themes overlap with themes of the book that I'm writing at the moment. So I'm hoping that the discussion can focus on a large extent. There's quite a lot of feedback with the noise, but hopefully that will stop. I think somebody needs to turn their microphone off. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. The themes that to me are the most interesting in this paper are those that occur towards the end, and I'm hoping that the discussion can focus to a large extent upon those themes. But I've sent you the paper over. I thought that it would just be easier to read it out if that's okay. And if there are any points that require further clarification, then either I'll do that, or please feel free to stop me and ask a question. I think I've probably got about 50 minutes, something like that. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thanks very much. So just the first section is really an introduction or abstract. The question I'm concerned with here is, what does it mean to say of the natural world that it's enchanted? Should we be describing it in these terms? And what does any of this have to do with God, or indeed the death of God? So I'm going to tackle these questions initially with reference to the secular conception of enchantment endorsed by John McDowell. And I argue in my monograph, God, Value and Nature, that McDowell's naturalism, his kind of liberal or expanded naturalism, can be rendered compatible with theism, and that this position's entirely defensible. So that's really my starting point in this paper, or towards the middle of this paper. If this is right, if we have a naturalism and a conception of enchantment that's actually compatible with theism, then there's room here for allowing that the natural world is divinely enchanted. And first of all, I try to make clear how that kind of position, which I'm not forcing anybody on anybody, I'm just saying it's a coherent position and it deserves to be taken seriously. So what I'm interested in this paper is how this position, according to which we can make sense of the idea that the natural world is divinely enchanted, to be reconciled with what Nietzsche says about the death of God in the context of discussing the so-called problem of nihilism. So I argue that a reconciliation is possible, but for the purposes of this paper, the thinking is rather quick, and some of you may find it quite unsatisfactory. So there are quite a few gaps that need to be filled in. And to repeat again, I'm not suggesting that I'm not suggesting that I've got a handy knockdown argument against or for any particular position. I'm just exploring what I take to be a really interesting possibility, and trying to get clear about where this leaves the problem of nihilism, which is a problem that I think a lot of us, perhaps not all of us, feel that we ought to be grappling with, that it's a genuine problem and pretty central and important. So in section 2, I just spell out some of the preliminaries, getting clear about what we mean by enchantment and disenchantment. So as you know, the image of disenchantment, Entzauberung, is borrowed from Max Weber, who was inspired in turn by a line in Friedrich Schiller's 1788 poem, Die Götter Griechenlands, the gods of Greece, in which reference is made to the idea of a de-divinized nature, a nature from which the gods have been eliminated. An enchanted nature, by contrast, is one in which the gods play some kind of fundamental role. And we get a perfect example of such a picture in the pre-scientific religiosity of one for whom the workings of nature are determined by unpredictable and volatile spirits and gods. The gods can be said to do magic in this sense, and they fill the voids in nature, the voids that we're unable to explain in scientific terms. Now, it remains to be seen where this leaves the kind of monotheistic framework, where arguably the gods don't do magic, but I want to argue eventually that it's compatible with such a framework that we can explain things in scientific terms, and that these terms are to be respected. Now, moving on to John McDowell, the significance of scientific explanation is fundamental to his commitment to a partially enchanted nature, which is spelled out in his book, Mind and Nature, Mind and World. He spells out his conception of disenchantment with reference to a contrast between two kinds of intelligibility, the kind sought by natural science and the kind to be found in a text, an utterance, or some other kind of action, as he puts it. So examples of the first kind of intelligibility are the movements of the planets and the fall of a sparrow. They're appropriate objects of scientific investigation, and they can be comprehended without any magical or enchanted ingredients. Enchantment for McDowell comes in at the second level of intelligibility. This kind of enchantment has its origin in the human mind, and this is said to involve a partial rather than a total enchantment of nature. So this partial enchantment of nature is to be distinguished from the more problematic position, which arises when we treat the behavior of everything as if it were on a level with a text, an utterance, or some other kind of action. This, as I've said, would involve a total enchantment of nature, and McDowell talks in this context of an appeal to explanatory factors that are occult, magical, and supernatural. So we're to suppose that his partial conception of nature is appropriately de-divinized and therefore doesn't involve reference to these supernatural, magical, or occult explanatory factors. So in McDowell, then, we've got a distinction between mindful and non-mindful behavior. And we can agree that that distinction is really important, that the movements of the planets and the fall of a sparrow belong to the latter, mindless category, and that we don't approach these phenomena in the way that we approach texts, utterances, or any other kind of action. We can agree also that modern natural science has performed an emancipatory role in this regard, so that we don't appeal to the magic-making gods when we're trying to figure out why there was a terrible storm over the weekend. So this much is indisputable, But there's a question of where it leaves us, particularly in the light of McDowell's insistence that nature's to be comprehended in partially enchanted terms. One of the points of insisting upon partial enchantment is to challenge the idea that nature is totally disenchanted. And McDowell argues that we're left with a totally disenchanted picture on the assumption that science is the only legitimate way of comprehending nature. Science in this context is natural science, and the complaint is that something important is left out of the picture if nature is comprehended in these terms alone. Namely, all the things that resist this level of explanation. Weber expresses similar misgivings along these lines, referring to the mechanized petrification to which we succumb in this context. He describes those who commit to this scientific approach as specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. Now, the nature and limits of scientific explanation are unclear, and there's no requirement that the various kinds of investigation conform to a single model. Furthermore, even granting that mechanistic explanation is to be distinguished from other modes of inquiry, it doesn't follow that everything's dead and inert at this level, and there are arguments within physics to challenge this assumption. Weber's image of mechanized petrification can be questioned to this degree at least. But even granting a richer conception of the relevant physical processes and interactions, it doesn't follow that everything's reducible to this level of explanation. And McDowell and Weber are surely right that such an approach leaves us with a deeply impoverished conception of nature, one which bears no resemblance to the ordinary world we inhabit, and which seems appropriately described as empty of meaning or disenchanted. So moving on to the third section. McDowell takes us beyond a world that is disenchanted in this scientific sense. That is to say, he insists that there's more to nature than what can be comprehended by the natural sciences alone. So there's a dimension of nature that exceeds this explanatory focus, and he concludes on this ground that nature is partially enchanted. It's partially enchanted in the sense that we're concerned with a level of meaning which is not applicable to everything. The question of what it means to describe this level of meaning as enchanted is more difficult. McDowell denies that the term has anything to do with magic, religion, or anything remotely supernatural or otherworldly. And he's concerned above all to accommodate the meanings which structure human existence and to which we're responsive as meaning seeking in animals. So enchantment is an irreducibly this worldly notion, and the phenomena of mind, meaning, and value are central to this dimension. The minds in question belong to humans rather than gods, and this human focus brings meaning and value into the picture. Not in the sense that these things are projected onto a nature which in itself is empty of meaning and value. This would be to revert to the disputed scientific picture. Rather, the idea is that there are aspects of the natural world that exceed the limits of scientific investigation and to which we're capable of responding as human beings. When, for example, we acknowledge the significance of love, the authority of value, and the impossibility of living as if these things amounted to nothing. McDowell's picture of a partially enchanted nature is totally de-divinized. And this flies in the face of the idea that a totally disenchanted world is a world in which the gods and God have vanished from the scene, and that they have taken all value and meaning in their wake. Schiller's talk of a de-divinized nature is explicit in this regard. It's presupposed by all those who insist that value has its source in God, And Nietzsche brings out the supposed consequences when, in his pronouncement of the death of God, he warns that we have, quote, wiped away the entire horizon, unchained this earth from its sun, and empty spaces breathing at us as a consequence. We can note, however, that the atheists to whom Nietzsche addresses this pronouncement have no real sense of the supposed difficulty. As they see it, God is irrelevant to value, and it's a childish superstition to endorse such a framework, a theistic framework. We know also that Nietzsche himself seeks an alternative, non-theistic way of supplying the required ground, as do a lot of contemporary philosophers working in this area, I take it. The idea that a God-involving framework involves childish superstition is familiar from our modern scientists' approach to the magic-making gods, and such an attitude is taken for granted in much contemporary philosophy. The implication here is that the introduction of God or gods is no more than an unsophisticated and pre-scientific attempt to comprehend the workings of nature. This is no doubt part of what's going on when Apollo was brought in to pull the sun's chariot across the sky, or when thunder in the mountains was explained with reference to the anger of the gods. But religion's not reducible to the desire to comprehend the world scientifically. It has a fundamentally moral and spiritual dimension. And as John Cottingham has put it, in the context of defending theistic religion, it involves a moral and spiritual opening of the self to the presence of the divine. Cottingham talks in this context of an epistemology of receptivity rather than one of control. The guiding question in this context being that of how I can embark upon a path of moral and spiritual change which might open me to a deeper awareness of something that I now glimpse only faintly. The contrast here is with the controlling attitude of one whose sole aim is to theorize and to know. Now, the idea of a moral and spiritual opening of the self is central to McDowell's scheme of things. But I mean, he doesn't use the term spiritual for some reason. Maybe he thinks, as a lot of atheists think, that it is too close to theism. Anyway, so he's got this idea of a moral opening of the self, but he denies that this involves being open to the divine, and would agree with Nietzsche's atheists that this addition is problematic, even while stopping short of describing such a commitment as a childish superstition. Now, the Latin etymology of the term superstition, superstare, is not explicitly pejorative, but it might be thought to lend justice to the complaint at issue here, for it's said to involve a, quote, standing still over by a thing, hence amazement, wonder, dread, especially of the divine or supernatural. McDowell would take issue with the idea that the thing in question is divine or supernatural, and it's worth asking whether he would allow that the self's openness can bring forth amazement, wonder, and dread. This question is important given the association of these terms with the notion of enchantment as intuitively understood, and given this notion's association with the divine and the supernatural. McDowell would no doubt retort that the attitudes of amazement, wonder, and so forth are perfectly explicable responses to the value-involving world in which we live and move and have our being. He could add that the whole point of a secular conception of enchantment is to provide a resolutely this-worldly focus so that we can make sense of the idea that meaning and value are to be found in the here and now rather than in some second supernatural realm. This is surely a point in favour of such a position, and it's taken seriously by all those who endorse an analogously secular conception of spirituality, doing so on the ground that it, and this is Robert Solomon, allows us to naturalise spirituality, to get away from otherworldly religions and philosophies, and to reappreciate or re-enchant everyday life. Robert Solomon says these words in the context of defending a Nietzschean conception of spirituality. And Nietzsche himself, as we know, castigates religion for its, quote, declared aversion to life, its slanders against the here and now, and every lie about the beyond. Talk of lies about the beyond returns us to Nietzsche's atheists. But we know that there's enough in Nietzsche to suggest a serious worry about whether this beyond can be removed whilst leaving everything in its place. Hence the claim that we've wiped away the entire horizon and unchained the earth from its sun. We have here two conflicting ways of understanding what it could mean for God to be part of the picture. According to the first approach, God is an entity which can be removed at no cost to what really matters. This is the typical atheist's conception of God, and the framework at issue here encourages this way of thinking. It does so in the sense that God is severed from what really matters. God, in this context, corresponds to the supernatural. The supernatural stands opposed to the natural, and there's no such thing as the supernatural. So the supernatural's dropped from the picture, and the natural world, the only world there is re-enchanted in the way that it couldn't have been if enchantment was linked with the supernatural realm, which turns out to be non-existent. So enchantment, on this way of thinking, is a this-worldly notion, and it survives the removal of the aforementioned supernatural entity, which was never in the business of providing the required notion of enchantment in any case, because God doesn't exist and there's no supernatural realm, etc., etc. Now, according to the second approach, which I take seriously, this first way of thinking about God is deeply problematic. And it is appropriate to describe it as a case of childish superstition, in the sense that it involves an immature conception of God. God is not an entity in this sense, and God's presence is so deeply intertwined in the natural world that the atheist's supposition that removing God is the easiest thing of all, provided that you're clever enough, makes no sense at all. On this second way of thinking, as Mulhall has summed it up, God is not so much an entity as a medium or a system of coordinates, and belief in God is best understood not as the addition of one supernatural entity to the supposed furniture of the universe, but rather as an atmosphere or framework that orients us in everything we say, think, and do. Hence the claim that in removing God, we've wiped away the entire horizon and enchained this earth from its sun. On this second picture, the supernatural and the natural are inextricably linked, and they stand and fall together. The implication here is that a secular conception of enchantment cannot be made good. Although I've noted that Nietzsche himself does not rule out the possibility of a non-theistic solution, and there are clearly issues about whether Nietzsche's position corresponds to the madman who is putting forward all of these claims about wiping away our entire horizon in that context. Now, it's familiar enough in theology and much philosophy that the entity conception of God is flawed. And I'm going to assume in what follows that this complaint's justified, even whilst acknowledging that the picture thinking to which we must so often resort in this context can encourage such a conception. I'm going to allow also that the second approach, according to which the natural and the supernatural are inextricably linked, constitutes a viable alternative, and that we have every reason to take it seriously. It's also, entirely orthodox from a classical theistic perspective, and the idea that God is omnipresent in everything. The question of where this leaves Nietzsche is both hugely important and unclear. I mean, obviously, a certain kind of atheist or Nietzschean can simply deny that the supernatural and the natural are intertwined in this theistic sense. And it's at this point that things get really unclear, but more on this later. So the question of where this leaves Nietzsche is both hugely important and unclear. And I shall make some tentative points in this direction towards the end. My main task, however, is to consider the implications for an understanding and assessment of a supposedly this-worldly conception of enchantment, and to make a case for rejecting its atheism, or at least calling it into question. My focus again is McDowell, but there are important implications here for secular conceptions of nature more generally. McDowell assumes that God, and gods more generally, can be removed from the picture at no cost to the reality of a world which is enchanting and enchanted in the relevant value-involving sense. He is with Nietzsche's atheists in this respect, and must therefore agree that the offending supernatural items are irrelevant to the world thus understood, a world according to which the natural world is evaluatively enchanted. We can agree that there are pictures, theistic pictures, to be rejected in this context. So, for example, we must reject the idea that nature is controlled by a realm of capricious gods, or that there is a single capricious god at the helm, or that pseudo explanations like this are preferable to scientific explanations. Things like this are irrelevant to the idea of an evaluatively enchanted world, but it does not follow that this is what it means to remove God, unless God is to be modelled on the offending items, or on items more generally. According to the position I wish to defend, God is no thing, and the natural and the supernatural are intertwined rather than dualistically opposed. More specifically, I challenge the idea that the God world and God value distinctions are as absolute and unambiguous as McDowell and other naturalists assume. And I want to make a case for claiming that the value involving natural world is God involving. Now, a similar diagnostic approach, which takes us to the idea that the natural world is God involving, is to be found in the theologian John Robinson's famous 1963 book, Honest to God. Robinson, or famous in the UK at least, Robinson is indebted here to various German theologians, all of whom seek to move beyond dualistic supernaturalism and reductive naturalism, people like Paul Tillich and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, etc. It should be clear from what has been said that McDowell himself is wanting to transcend a dualism along these lines, a dualism between dualistic supernaturalism and reductive naturalism. Hence his insistence that one can be an anti-scientistic naturalist without succumbing to suspect supernaturalism. The difference, however, is that whereas McDowell rules out the possibility that the desired middle ground could have theistic import, on the ground that God could only ever be a further supernatural thing, Robinson's theologians identify the offending picture with a suspect supernaturalism and distinguish it from theism, which is non-dualistic in the relevant sense. So Paul Tillich takes this to involve bringing a naturalist critique to supernaturalism, and he argues that once the relevant idol, God as a supernatural being, has been torn down, we're in a position to, quote, challenge the naturalist's assumption that God is merely a redundant name for nature or for humanity. This is what he says in the context of defending the idea that a more expansive or ecstatic naturalism, as Tillich puts it, could accommodate a transcendent God. He says, to call God transcendent in this sense does not mean that one must establish a superworld of divine objects. It does mean that within itself, the finite world points beyond itself. In other words, it is self-transcendent. And this is Robinson's summary of the approach. This, I believe, is Tillich's great contribution to theology, the reinterpretation of transcendence in a way which preserves its reality while detaching it from the projection of supranaturalism, which is Robinson's term for suspect's dualistic supernaturalism. The divine, as he sees it, does not inhabit a transcendent world above nature. It is to be found in the ecstatic character of this world as its transcendent depth and ground. Now, this kind of position is pretty familiar from people like Spinoza and Hegel, I think, and it offers a very different way of understanding what it could mean to talk about the divine. It lends plausibility to the idea that God could be the beyond in the midst, as Bonhoeffer puts it, and it suggests a corresponding deconstruction of the very idea of the this-worldly. After all, if the world, the only world there is, has transcendent depths, then it makes no sense to set it against some otherworldly realm, and the very idea of the this-worldly loses its point. And that's the kind of thing that an secular expansive naturalist like James Griffin says in the context of making sense of the idea that the world is evaluatively enchanted. And he keeps saying, this world is the only world there is. We don't need another supernatural realm, where that's to be interpreted as a criticism of the theist and the insistence or conclusion that we don't need to go in a theistic direction because that would take us away from the idea that this is the only world there is and the only world that we need, to postulating or the postulation of another supernatural realm. Anyway, we've got this idea then from Tillich that the world, the only world there is, has these transcendent depths. And, you know, it's also made clear that there are serious limits to what can be said about these transcendent depths. But one of the points that's made at positive level is that it makes no sense to set this world with its transcendent depths against some otherworldly realm. And as I've said, if we move into this territory, then the idea of the this worldly loses its point. Now, we've arrived at a somewhat contorted version of the final stage of Nietzsche's History of an Error in Twilight of the Idols. Contorted in the sense that whereas for Nietzsche and contemporary philosophy more generally, atheism seems to be the solution to the error of theism, the enticing suggestion here is that the reverse is true, or at least that atheism is premature, and a properly non-dualistic position is compatible with theism. But where does this leave McDowell? And where does it leave Nietzsche's problem of nihilism? Now, this is where the whole thing gets really confusing and problematic in my head, at least. And I'm just grappling with it at the moment in writing the final chapter of the book I'm writing. But I'm still not clear about these issues, and it would be really helpful to talk about them. So, according to the position at issue, we're to reject the framework in which God is to be located in some second supernatural distant realm, a realm that we can just claim to be completely irrelevant to what really matters. So as to allow instead that this world points in a theistic direction. And again, the point is not, here we've got a neat knockdown argument, you've got to be theists. It's not that. It's, if you take seriously what the expansive naturalist says and go beyond a very narrow scientific conception of nature, then once you get to the point of how to think about the world as enchanted or evaluative, the boundaries between theism and non-theism become really blurred, precisely because you've moved away from that idea of God as a dispensable entity. So that's the issue. The boundaries are really blurred here, and it's really difficult to figure out how to view the distinction between theistic and non-theistic once you move away from that problematic conception of God that no sensible theologian would accept in any case. So we've moved away from that problematic idea and allowed that this world points in a theistic direction. The natural world has transcendent depths in this respect. And given the traditional connection between God and goodness, God as essentially good, God as the source of goodness, it makes sense to suppose that the natural world thus conceived is evaluatively enchanted in McDowell's value-involving sense. Now, McDowell's hugely indebted to Iris Murdoch's Platonist vision, and Murdoch describes what she calls her true naturalism as involving a commitment to the idea that, quote, as moral beings, we are immersed in a reality which transcends us, and that moral progress consists in awareness of this reality and submission to its purposes. She talks in this context of the infinite difficulty of the task of apprehending a magnetic but inexhaustible reality. Now, the theistic undertones are clear, but Murdoch takes herself to be operating within an atheistic framework, albeit one which she claims promises a more authentic form of religion, a religion without God. The implication is, in Murdoch, is that theistic religion is a form of idolatry, and that we must move beyond God. If we're to see matters aright, we must go from God to the good. Now, the more compelling alternative in the light of what I have said is that religion can be and often is idolatrous, that there are faulty conceptions of God, but that nothing has been said to rule out the possibility that the relevant deficiencies and bad ways of thinking can be overcome, and that the moral reality whose purposes we submit to in this context has theistic significance. And again, I think once you blur the boundary between the theistic and non-theistic, it's really, really difficult to deny that possibility, at least if you're somebody like Murdoch, who's happy with Platonism and who utterly defends a Platonist position against what she takes to be the problematic scientific alternative. Now, one question you might ask is, doesn't this lead us back to a totally enchanted world? Now, let's agree with McDowell and Murdoch, presumably, that natural scientific explanation is to be given its due place in the task of understanding the natural world, and that modern science has emancipated us from primitive versions of how this task might be completed. Let's agree also that there's more to understanding than scientific understanding, and that a concession along these lines puts us in a position to appreciate dimensions of nature that elude a purely scientific approach. However, none of this rules out the possibility that nature could be enchanted in a God-involving way. For the theist can grant the significance of scientific investigation, and even if she allows that the relevant findings offer scope for theological reflection, which she will, it's no part of her position that these approaches are to be conflated, scientific or non-scientific modes of understanding, nor that God interferes with the workings of nature in the manner of the magic-making gods. God is not like that, at least according to the sensible theism that I'm taking seriously. Now, this isn't to deny, of course, that there are difficult questions concerning how we're to make sense of divine action. The point is simply that there's nothing here to compromise the autonomy and legitimacy of science, and every reason for thinking that a world which is enchanted in a God-involving sense can accommodate the distinctions so important to someone like McDowell. We should bear in mind also, though, that the worldview of one for whom the workings of nature are controlled by the gods, the magic-making gods, deficiencies or scientific deficiencies notwithstanding, gives limited but significant expression to an insight which is fundamental to McDowell's anti-scientism, and whose importance is preempted by Weber when, in the context of introducing the term disenchantment, he describes the process of intellectualization which arose in the wake of modern science, and identifies the meaning of this process as involving the claim that, quote, we can in principle control everything by means of calculation. The insight in question is that calculation has its limits, and that the need to control must be tempered by an attitude of receptivity or Gelassenheit. The point's familiar from Cottingham when he talks about that epistemology of receptivity rather than control, and its expression in the present context returns us to the idea that there's more to the attitude of Weber's primitive savage than the desire to comprehend the world scientifically. So the last bit with Nietzsche, and a bit that's a bit scrambled. So I've made a case for taking seriously the idea that the natural world's divinely enchanted. And I've argued that this framework does nothing or involves nothing that could contravene McDowell's preferred secularist approach. So it allows him to make the distinctions that he's making, but it's a way of saying that actually if you go down McDowell's route, you've implicitly opened the door to theism, and it's none the worse for that. That's fine. So, I mean, the question here is, does this mean that I take myself to have an instant solution to Nietzsche's problem of nihilism, and that we can now happily reconnect the earth to its sun so that the entire horizon of the meanings which structure human existence and to which we're responsive as human beings are restored rather than wiped away? I mean, this is the thing that worries me, because it can make it sound as if I'm failing to acknowledge a really fundamental problem that goes beyond, you know, some of the boring philosophical issues that can arise, but that's absolutely central to what it means to be human. And it can make it sound as if I'm wiping away that entire issue in the way that Nietzsche's madman tells us that we're wiping away the horizon of meaning. And I don't think that I'm doing that, but I think that I'm doing more than what Nietzsche takes himself to be doing when he tries to find a secular alternative to theism to make it possible to live in the world again happily or meaningfully. So the issues here are really complex, and it's not possible to do proper justice to them in the time I've got left. But the following points can be made. First, When Mulhall describes the atheist's indifferent response to the madman's pronouncement of the death of God, he adds that their attitude is premised upon a conception of God as an illusory entity, and that this is why they're wholly indifferent to God's demise. The point's familiar from before, and it suggests that the atheists are looking in the wrong place for God. The obvious addition to this is that they need to redirect their attention. And this has been my diagnostic approach to McDowell's secular framework and to the secular conceptions of enchantment. They're looking in the wrong place for God, failing to see that God's already where they're failing to find him, a bit like Hume on the self or Hume on substance. Now, Mulhall seems to be gesturing in a similar direction when he says of Nietzsche's madman that, quote, he finds this conception of God as an illusory entity to be far more childish than the religious faith it claims to have outgrown. What he goes on to say on his behalf, however, suggests something more radical. Quote, his contention is that a perception of God as non-existent does not amount to the transcendence of an illusion. It is not a discovery, but a deed, and a bloody, terrifying one at that, for which we must take responsibility. We are God's murderers. His presence was real, part of the living tissue of our culture, our responses, our most intimate self-understanding. His destruction is therefore a radical act of violence, not only against him, but against ourselves. Hence the madman compares the death of God to the wiping away of a horizon, to the swallowing up of an ocean, to the loss of spatial orientation. So the claim now is that in removing God from our scheme of things, the atheist has done something cataclysmic which threatens to implicate all of us, whether we know it or not. It suggests a collective turning away from value and meaning, an act for which we must all take responsibility. We are the source of disenchantment in this sense, and according to the most radical interpretation, there's no turning back. This more radical interpretation is difficult to accept, not simply in the existential, I can't live with this sense, but in the sense that it's difficult to reconcile with the reality of moral achievement and the idea that we ourselves are capable of lighting up the world in this respect, even in the face of the familiar evils and temptations. Now, the atheist will conclude on this basis that the madman's worries are overblown and that the death of God is little more than a storm in a teacup. The theist can respond that lighting up the world in the relevant ways is just what it means for God's presence to be real. And it seems fitting to end this paper with a point made by the theologian Grace Jansen, when in a paper on the Nietzschean abyss, she tells us, quote, and in the context of talking about Heidegger a bit as well, she says, God will come only as love is born within us, only as we ourselves become divine. And she closes with the following quotation from the medieval mystic Hadovich. Oh, how deep is the abyss of love. Her deepest abyss is her most beautiful form. To lose one's way is to touch her close at hand. To die of hunger for her is to feed and taste. Wordlessness is her most beautiful utterance. Her withdrawal is approach. Her deepest silence is her sublime song. Now, the notion of enchantment reaches its zenith in this context. It offers a serious response to Nietzsche's atheists, and it does so by pointing us towards the unfathomable abyss of the divine nature and the human heart, which Jansen contrasts with Nietzsche's abyss of hell and is wanting to try to bring the two together somehow. And now, none of this is a knockdown argument, as I keep saying, but it's eminently worthy of consideration in light of all that's been said. And I think, just to finish, that one of the things that I'm wanting to grapple with is the idea that the problem of nihilism is not just a kind of neat little theoretical problem that you'll be able to solve if you're clever enough. And I guess that's obvious, and it's obvious to Nietzsche. And what I'm saying towards the end of the paper is giving us a sense it's a really practical issue, a dead important practical issue here that we need to be able to engage with. And it's something more than, as I've said, a kind of boring theoretical problem that you can refute and show how clever you are in the process. It's something more at issue than that. So, I mean, I'm going to finish at that point, and thank you very much for bearing with me, and I hope it wasn't completely impenetrable. It's felt very difficult as I was reading it, and it just reminded me of how difficult these issues are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fiona, for this very inspiring, deep, complex, but very engaging talk. And now the floor is open for discussion.